A chef is standing in a professional kitchen somewhere in a major city. This chef is talented, trained, adventurous. The kind of person who has cooked rattlesnake, served fermented shark, prepared dishes involving organs that most people would rather not identify by name. They have made a career of challenging culinary boundaries and watching food critics rediscover their courage bite by bite. Tonight, they are preparing something new. The protein source is nutritionally complete. High in protein, low in fat, readily available, locally sourced if you want to stretch that term to its absolute limit, and essentially free. The animal in question is abundant beyond almost any other urban mammal on Earth. It reproduces fast enough that harvesting it in quantity creates no ecological concern whatsoever. It has been eaten by humans on multiple continents throughout documented history. It is, by any rational nutritional and ecological assessment, an entirely reasonable food source. The chef plates it beautifully, garnishes it thoughtfully, serves it to the table. And the table, despite containing people who flew to Japan specifically to eat pufferfish and who have strong opinions about the correct preparation of sea urchin, reacts with a unanimity that no other dish has ever produced. The plates are pushed away. Expressions are deployed that the human face reserves for a specific category of extreme reaction. Several people leave. One person makes a noise usually associated with medical emergencies. Nobody eats the rat. This is, when you actually examine it, a remarkable thing. Here is an animal that is present in essentially every human settlement on Earth. An animal so nutritionally adequate that laboratory science has used it as a model for human dietary research for decades. An animal that has fed human populations historically and continues to feed them in parts of the world today. And yet, for the majority of the modern world, particularly in Western cultures, the idea of eating rat triggers a disgust response so powerful and so uniform that even professional chefs serving it in controlled settings with full disclosure cannot reliably get people to take a second bite. Why? That question turns out to have multiple layers: biological, cultural, historical, ecological, and the psychological. And unpacking all of them produces a picture of how human food choice actually works that is considerably more interesting than the simple answer of "because it's disgusting" that most people would offer. The first thing worth establishing is that the premise embedded in the question, that humans don't eat rats, is not universally true. It is true for much of the modern Western world, and it feels universally true to people within that cultural context. But the global picture is considerably more varied. In Vietnam, grilled rat is a genuine delicacy in rural areas, particularly during harvest season when rice field rats are fat and available in quantity. The rats consumed are field rats rather than urban species, Rattus argentaventor and related species that live in agricultural ecosystems rather than sewers. But the biological distinction between these and urban rats is considerably smaller than most Western consumers would find comforting. They are prepared in multiple ways: grilled over charcoal, fried, curried, stewed. They appear in restaurants. They are sold in markets. They are not considered poverty food. They are considered good food. And people who can afford other things choose rat because they prefer it. In Cambodia, rat is similarly integrated into the food culture of rural areas. During periods of agricultural abundance, rats are harvested from rice paddies in significant quantities and represent a meaningful protein supplement in the diets of rural communities. Urban Cambodians who have moved from rural backgrounds often retain an appreciation for rat preparation methods learned in childhood. The food carries cultural meaning alongside its nutritional value. In parts of West Africa, cane rats, Thrionomes swinderianus, a large rodent also called grasscutter, are among the most valued and expensive meat sources in local markets. This is not a marginal food consumed only by the very poor. Grasscutter meat commands premium prices relative to chicken or beef in parts of Ghana, Nigeria, and Côte d'Ivoire. Grasscutter farming, raising the animals deliberately for food production, is an Established agricultural practice with extension services, farming manuals, and economic development interest. The animal is large enough that a single individual provides substantial meat, and the flavor is reportedly excellent by any measure. In Laos, China's Guangdong province, and parts of the Philippines, various rodent species appear in regional food cultures with varying degrees of current prevalence. In some Amazonian indigenous communities, large rodents, including capybara, the world's largest rodent, have traditionally been and continue to be significant food sources. Capybara consumption among indigenous communities and in some South American countries extends to Catholic communities, who obtained a historical ruling classifying the semi-aquatic animal as a fish for Lenten purposes, which is perhaps the most creative theological food classification in recorded history. So the accurate framing of the question is not, why don't humans eat rats, but why do people in wealthy, Western, urbanized societies refuse to eat rats when people elsewhere eat them without difficulty and often with enthusiasm? That framing immediately suggests that the answer is cultural rather than purely biological. And it is, though the biological dimension has its own important contributions. The disgust response is the primary mechanism through which rat avoidance operates in Western contexts, and understanding how disgust works reveals why the aversion is so powerful and so resistant to rational override. Disgust is one of the most ancient and robust emotional systems in human psychology. Unlike many emotions, it has a characteristic universal facial expression recognized across cultures. The nose wrinkle, raised upper lip, narrowed eyes, that appears in infants and cross-cultural samples in ways suggesting deep evolutionary roots. It evolved primarily as a pathogen avoidance system, a behavioral immune response that produced aversion to stimuli associated with contamination risk, including spoiled food, bodily waste, certain animals, and disease-associated substances. The animals most reliably triggering disgust responses across human populations share a profile. They are associated with waste, decay, disease, or environments containing these elements. Cockroaches, flies, maggots, rats, mice, these animals cluster together in the disgust-triggering category, partly because they genuinely are associated with environments where pathogens concentrate, and partly because they have accumulated cultural elaboration of that association into comprehensive symbolic frameworks of contamination and filth. The rat's position in this disgust framework is reinforced by a genuine ecological reality. Urban rats, specifically, are animals that live in sewers, garbage accumulations, and waste disposal systems. They genuinely do carry pathogens: Weil's disease from Leptospira bacteria, hantavirus, various bacteria transmitted through contact with rat urine and feces. The urban rat's disease association is not invented cultural mythology. It is a documented epidemiological reality that has shaped human attitudes toward rats over centuries of cohabitation in urban environments where sanitation was poor enough to make rat-transmitted disease a meaningful mortality risk. The problem is that disgust, once established through this genuine contamination association, does not limit its effects to urban rats that have actually lived in sewers. Disgust generalizes. The category rat triggers the disgust response regardless of whether the specific rat in question has ever been near a sewer. A farm-raised rat fed on grain in a clean facility is, neurologically speaking, processed by the human disgust system identically to a sewer rat, because the category rather than the individual triggers the response. This categorical generalization is why rational arguments about the cleanliness of specific individuals or the nutritional adequacy of properly prepared rat don't reliably override the aversion. They are addressing the wrong processing system. The history of rat consumption in Western cultures tells a nuanced story of economic necessity and cultural transformation that illuminates how food taboos form and solidify. Medieval European peasants ate a considerably wider range of animals than their descendants consider acceptable today. Dietary choices in pre-modern agricultural societies were constrained primarily by what was available, and what wasn't actively poisonous Cultural restrictions on particular protein sources were a luxury of sufficiency. Historical records from periods of food scarcity, sieges, famines, severe winters document rat consumption as a matter of survival without particular moral weight attached to the choice. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. During the Siege of Paris in 1870 to 71, when Prussian forces surrounded the city for 4 months, Parisians consumed rats and various zoo animals as the food supply dwindled. Rat became a commodity with a market price. Butchers sold them, restaurants prepared them. The people who ate them were not the desperately poor. They were middle-class Parisians doing what middle-class Parisians have historically done, adapting to available ingredients and discussing the results. The reinforcement of rat taboo in Western cultures correlates with improvements in food security and urban sanitation infrastructure that occurred through the 18th and 19th centuries. As food became more reliably available and as alternative protein sources became consistently accessible, the economic pressure to consume whatever was available relaxed. Simultaneously, as urban sanitation improved and rat control became a public health priority, the cultural framing of rats shifted from a nuisance species that was also sometimes food to a pest species that was exclusively a problem to be eliminated. The same animal that had been a meal in a Paris siege became purely vermin in a context of adequate food supply and functioning sewage systems. This shift illustrates a broader pattern in food cultural evolution. The proteins that people stop eating when they become prosperous enough to choose tend to be the ones most thoroughly recategorized as non-food. The recategorization is reinforced by social signaling. Eating rat in a context where it marks poverty creates negative social associations that outlast the actual poverty that motivated the consumption. Upper classes define their distance from lower classes partly through food choice, and foods associated with desperation or low status accumulate cultural stigma that persists long after the original material circumstances are gone. The category distinction that most influences rat consumption patterns globally, the distinction between field rats and urban rats, is worth examining in detail because it maps almost exactly onto where rat consumption is accepted and where it is rejected. Field rats eat grain, insects, plant material, and agricultural produce. Their diet is the same diet that produces acceptable meat in other animals. Chickens eat grain and insects, pigs eat kitchen scraps, beef cattle eat grass. A rice field rat eating rice for its entire life is nutritionally equivalent to any grain-fed animal, and the meat quality reflects this. People who eat field rats routinely describe the flavor as mild and pleasant. Comparable to rabbit or chicken, which is a comparison that appears repeatedly in accounts from different cultures and should probably be taken at face value given the number of independent sources making it. Urban rats eat garbage. They eat sewage. They eat whatever decomposing organic material is available in the waste streams of human civilization. Their diet is a comprehensive inventory of everything humans have discarded, and their bodies reflect this nutritional biography. The pathogen load in urban rat tissue reflects both their diet and their environment. Bacteria and parasites transmitted through their food sources and living conditions accumulate in ways that make urban rat tissue a genuinely higher risk protein source than field rat tissue. The health risk distinction between urban and field rats is real, but probably smaller than Western cultural intuition suggests. Proper cooking, bringing the internal temperature of meat to levels that kill pathogens, addresses most of the disease risk associated with both categories. The documented cases of disease transmission from rat consumption are almost exclusively associated with inadequate cooking or with handling live or recently killed animals rather than consuming properly cooked meat. The same proper preparation that makes pork safe despite its known disease transmission risks applies to rat. Thorough cooking eliminates most pathogen risk. But the rational risk distinction between adequately prepared rat and adequately prepared pork is essentially irrelevant to the disgust response. That operates in Western cultural contexts, because the disgust response is not processing risk assessments. It is processing categorical information. This is rat, Rats are contaminated, do not eat. The risk calculation never gets made because the emotional system shorts out the process before rational evaluation begins. The ecological argument for rat consumption deserves serious attention because it is genuinely compelling in ways that go beyond the theoretical. Urban rats represent an enormous biomass of protein distributed throughout human settlements at essentially zero cost of production. Unlike livestock, they require no dedicated agricultural land, no feed inputs beyond whatever waste they scavenge, no water beyond what they find. They reproduce at rates that mean harvesting populations in quantity has minimal ecological impact. They are, by any measure of input to output efficiency, an extraordinarily efficient protein source. They produce their own protein from waste streams that would otherwise generate no caloric value for humans. The global livestock industry, the system that produces the chicken, pork, and beef that Western cultures comfortably consume, involves massive land use, water consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, and feed grain inputs that represent a substantial ecological footprint. The comparison between the ecological cost of industrial livestock production and the ecological cost of rat consumption, which is essentially zero, should, from a purely rational environmental perspective, provoke some reflection about why the former is morally comfortable while the latter is culturally unthinkable. This is not a serious proposal that Western cities begin harvesting their rat populations for protein. The practical, regulatory, and cultural obstacles are overwhelming. But the thought exercise illuminates something important about the relationship between environmental impact and food cultural acceptability. They are largely disconnected in ways that food systems researchers find both striking and challenging to address. The insect protein movement has made some progress precisely by framing insects as a rational, ecological alternative to conventional livestock, targeting consumers already motivated by environmental concerns. The same framing has been applied, more tentatively, to rodent protein in some food futurism conversations. Neither has yet achieved significant mainstream penetration in Western markets because the disgust obstacle does not yield easily to ecological arguments. But the conversation exists, which represents a further development from the position of 20 years ago. Rat domestication represents an entirely different dimension of the human-rat relationship that complicates the consumption question in interesting ways. The domestic rat, Rattus norvegicus domesticus, is one of the most widely kept pet animals in many Western countries. Bred selectively for tameness, varied coat colors, and manageable size, domestic rats have accumulated a substantial population of human keepers who regard them as intelligent, affectionate, and entertaining companion animals. Rat owners are often vocally attached to their animals and consider the idea of rat consumption morally equivalent to eating a pet dog. Simultaneously, the Norway rat, the same species as the domestic rat, is considered a serious urban pest requiring aggressive control measures including poisoning, trapping, and various extermination techniques. The same animal is both a cherished companion and a target for municipal extermination programs, depending on whether it was born in a pet store or a subway tunnel. This categorical splitting, pet rat versus pest rat, is a striking example of how human food and relationship categories overlay the same biological material with completely different moral frameworks. The domestic rat and the sewer rat are Rattus norvegicus. Their genetics are essentially identical. The difference between them is entirely a function of context, handling history, and the category into which human culture has sorted them. In cultures where rat is food, the pet-rat relationship is simply less developed. The animal has not been accumulated into the companion animal category with the same intensity, and so the cognitive dissonance of simultaneously affectionating and eating it does not arise. The category through which the animal is processed determines the response it receives, and categories vary by culture, context, and historical trajectory. Laboratory rats, another dimension of the human-rat relationship, have contributed to a strange additional layer of complexity in how Western cultures think about rats as potential food. The laboratory rat has been the dominant animal model in biomedical research for over a century. The understanding of human nutrition, pharmacology, disease mechanisms, and countless other biomedical domains was built substantially on experiments conducted in rat models. In an ironic inversion of the usual human-animal food relationship, the rat's body has been used to understand the human body to a degree matched by no other animal. Rats fed various diets, exposed to various compounds, subjected to various interventions, with the results extrapolated to human biology through the genuine similarity of mammalian physiology. The rat's value as a research model derives precisely from its biological similarity to humans, similar enough that findings in rats translate meaningfully to human biology, different enough to make experimentation ethically permissible in ways that human experimentation is not. This instrumental relationship with rat biology has not, notably, translated into increased comfort with rat consumption in laboratory cultures. If anything, the intimate knowledge of rat internal organ systems and physiology that laboratory workers develop seems to reinforce rather than reduce the aversion to consuming those organs. The price question is one that rarely appears in discussions of why people don't eat rats, but is relevant to understanding the full picture. In cultures where rat is food, it commands prices reflecting its value. Vietnamese field rat, at peak quality during harvest season, can cost more per kilogram than chicken in local markets. West African grasscutter consistently commands premium prices. The economic value of rat as food in cultures that eat it reflects consumer preference rather than desperation. If rat were simply poverty food, it would be priced accordingly. The premium pricing signals that consumers who can choose otherwise are choosing rat because they prefer it, not because nothing else is available. This pricing reality undermines the narrative that rat consumption is purely a desperation response to food insecurity. Across multiple cultures and contexts, rat is a preferred food for people with access to alternatives, which means the Western assumption that rat consumption signals deprivation is a projection of Western cultural frameworks onto food cultures operating on entirely different principles. If Western cultural frameworks ever shifted to accommodate rat as a food category, which would require a degree of cultural transformation that seems unlikely in the near term, but is not theoretically impossible, the economics of rat production would be more favorable than almost any other protein source. Zero feed cost, zero land cost, reproduction rates that outpace any conventional livestock species, and an existing urban distribution system that requires no construction. The deepest and most honest answer to why Western humans don't eat rats is that they don't because they don't. The circularity of that answer is intentional. Food choices in established food cultures are substantially self-perpetuating. People eat what they eat because it is what people eat. The category is encoded in childhood, reinforced by social context, and maintained by disgust responses that resist rational override. This self-perpetuation is not unique to rat avoidance. It characterizes the entire structure of food culture. People who grew up eating insects find the Western aversion to insect consumption baffling. People who grew up eating dog find the Western affection for dogs as non-food companion animals culturally interesting. People who grew up eating raw fish found 50 years ago that the prospect of convincing Western consumers to eat sushi seemed essentially impossible. And then it happened through a combination of cultural exposure, diaspora restaurants, and the gradual normalization of what had been categorically foreign. Food cultures change. They change slowly and unevenly, and against resistance from deeply embedded disgust systems and cultural frameworks. But they change. The trajectory of any particular food from unthinkable to normal is usually a gradual accumulation of exposure, events, framing shifts, and social proof from trusted sources until the categorical wall breaks down and the item becomes just another option. Rat has a longer way to travel on that trajectory than most foods, in most Western contexts. The disgust load is substantial. The alternative protein options are abundant. The cultural elaboration of rat as contamination vector rather than food source is deeply entrenched. The pet-rat relationship creates additional categorical conflict. And the urban rat's genuine ecological character, its actual association with waste streams, provides ongoing material reinforcement for the cultural category rather than allowing it to drift out of relevance. But somewhere in Vietnam, someone is grilling a rice field rat over charcoal and finding it excellent. In a West African market, grass cutter is selling at a premium. In a Cambodian village, Rat curry is being prepared from ingredients that took no agricultural land to produce, generated no feed grain inputs, and cost nothing beyond the labor of catching them. The rat doesn't know it's not supposed to be food. It just knows it's well cooked, and it tastes, by most accounts of people who eat it regularly, remarkably like chicken. Which might be the most uncomfortable sentence in this entire exploration, because you had no problem with the chicken.